Hi everyone, my name is Maggie McDonald and I'm with Group 3. Today we are going to be discussing with you about influenza H3N2 virus, which occurred in 1968.
Hi everyone, I'm Lindsay Kilgore.
Hi, I'm Savannah Lambert.
Hello, I'm Nora Madden Lunsford, and Kendall Harrell, she is in a place with really bad Wi-Fi, so she'll be unable to join us today, but we'll read her slides for her.
HistoryChannel.com remarks that 1968 was one of the most tumultuous single years in history. This year consisted of many important political and social issues. The events include the first adult heart transplant, North Korea captured the USS Pueblo and its crew, the Tet Offensive, which was where North Vietnam and Viet Cong forces attacked South Vietnam, surprising the US and South Korean forces. This was aired on TV in the US, which caused a lot of uproar because the administration had claimed that the US and the South were winning the war. On April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis when he was there supporting striking sanitation workers. There were mass demonstrations from students all over the world. Poland, West Germany, Mexico City, Paris, and Italy, to name a few. This year also had many demonstrations, protests, and massacres for civil rights, and in the protest of the Vietnam War. On June 5th, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles on the night of the California primary, which he won. The first Special Olympics were held, the Pope opposed contraception, and Boeing came out with the biggest passenger plane called the Boeing 747 Jumbo Jet. During the Olympics, two U.S. athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, saluted the Black Power movement during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. And afterwards, they were actually thrown off the team. Richard Nixon ended up winning the election, and Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman to be elected in the House of Representatives. Yale finally decided to admit women after 267 years, and after 11 months, North Korea released the USS Pueblo crew while keeping the boat. Lastly, Apollo 8 was the first manned spacecraft to orbit the moon. Since there were so many events in this year, the 1968 pandemic is sometimes overlooked.
Not only was 1968 a very happening year, but there was a lot going on concerning influenza in the 1950s and 60s. In 1956, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, their influenza branch, was designated a World Health Organization collaborating center for surveillance, epidemiology, and the control of influenza. In 1957, the H3N2 virus triggered a pandemic. In 1960, the annual influenza vaccines began to be recommended for at-risk groups. In 1961, there was an outbreak in South Africa that suggested a reservoir of influenza A viruses among birds. And in 1967, Dr. H.G. Pereira proposed that there was a relationship between human and avian flu viruses. Then in 1968, the H3N2 pandemic struck, which is what we'll be talking about today. So the influenza A H3N2 variant virus, it originated in Hong Kong in 1968, and the first case of it was recorded in the United States in September of 1968. Most cases were seen in people who were older than 65. In this pandemic, it came in two waves, the second of which was more severe and struck in 1969 and 70, and we'll see a nice graph of that in the next picture, in the next slide. And H3N2 viruses, they're still circling today. They've joined the seasonal influenza viruses, and it undergoes antigenic drift regularly. And in this diagram up on your right, you'll see that the H3N2 virus is actually a combination of the 1957 H2N2 human virus and the H3 avian virus. And so we'll see that because of the vaccination that Air Force cadets had for H2N2, this reduced the H3N2 infection rate by 54%. So there was already a sort of herd immunity for this pandemic. And here we see the timeline of infections. Here's a peak of seasonal influenza. And then here we see the H3N2 initial appearance. And then here's the first wave of cases, mostly centered in North America. And then we see the second, more severe wave, which was more centered in Europe and in Asia.
In 1968, the world population was 3.6 billion, and in the United States, the population was 200.71 million. There were 1 million deaths worldwide and 116,000 in the US from this pandemic. The mortality rate was 0.027% of the population worldwide, and in the US, the mortality rate was 0.057 of the population.
So as we can see, the morbidity and mortality rates were much lower compared to other pandemics, as they were below 0.5%. And so this pandemic has been labeled the mildest flu pandemic of the 20th century. And like other pandemics, it did have a disproportionate impact on older individuals, because those who are 65 years and older have a higher rate for comorbidities, which increase their risk for complications with influenza. And so that can lead to more hospitalizations in this age group.
Sorry, I was muted. Responses. There was increase in communication and awareness of H3N2 pandemic. For example, there was communication between the National Influenza Center at the University of Hong Kong when they isolated the H3N2 virus, with institutions conducting multiple studies, such as World Influenza Center in London, International Influenza Center for the Americas in Atlanta, Georgia, and National Communicable Disease Center, now Center for Disease Control and Prevention. These institutions communicated on monitoring instituted surveillance. The United States increased surveillance, and they expanded systems that were implemented to monitor the pandemic. This communication included reports on schools and workplace absenteeism, school closures, admissions in hospitals, and visits to the outpatient facilities. Communications also involved obtaining information on people returning from Asia and other European countries. This communication network and surveillance provided a lot of data that was used for focusing and pursue for further research for improving prevention and controlling influenza. When we came to treatment, there were advances and improved treatment. For example, they developed antiviral and expanded the influenza vaccine that provided a stronger weapon to fight the pandemic. They started to use of antivirals, antibiotics, even immunizations. The United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, approved the first antiviral called amantadine, which was used for chemoprophylaxis. In addition, in studies conducted, this drug showed effectiveness. The findings showed reduction in the severity and reduction of duration in the illness. Despite its effectiveness, it was recommended for change. I don't know why, but the vaccines were also developed by the Division of Biologics Standard of the Nation Institutions of Health in Hong Kong. 110,000 new vaccines were provided on November 16 in 1968 during the peak of the pandemic.
When the outbreak occurred in July of 1968, people continued to travel like normal. There were no known restrictions on air travel throughout the entire pandemic, which aided in the spread of the flu. Allowing people to travel internationally led to Americans coming home from the war in Vietnam, bringing it to the United States. Social distancing was not a priority or commonly known suggestion at the time. Schools were allowed to stay open and continue as normal, although many schools were struggling with high absentee rates and even closure. The peak of the first wave in the United States occurred between December 14th and January 11th, most likely due to holiday travel. People also were not quarantining or staying home, continuing with business as usual. Woodstock actually took place during this pandemic in August of 1969, with an estimate of around 500,000 people in attendance. Not only were there other issues going on in the world during this time, but people also benefited from herd immunity to this strain of the flu due to the vaccine being distributed during the peak of the pandemic in early 1969. Infection control was the most effective and popular risk communication source, which consisted of hospitalization for those who were infected, vaccinations, and antibiotics. Communication networks and United States flu surveillance systems were helpful in population studies for vaccination trials. There was a conference in the fall of 1969 where the director of epidemiology at the National Communicable Disease Center, now known as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, reiterated the fact that there was a dire need for revised data sharing methods to include better demographics, severity of symptoms and complications, and socioeconomic factors that contribute to mortality.
Lesson learned: H3N2 led to the development of trivalent vaccines and of subunit vaccines. US also began recommending annual flu vaccination for high-risk individuals. More research was done on how to minimize fatalities. They did this by improving medical care and making antibiotics effective for secondary bacteria infections available. The World Health Organization began to implement a better system for forecasting, preventing, and controlling influenza outbreaks. Importance of global collaboration when handling a pandemic. Collaboration of teams and various organizations on local, state, and federal levels are needed to provide surveillance.
Thank you so much for watching our presentation on the H3N2 virus. Y'all have a great day.